When I arrived home from the hospital, I found my elderly mother tied to a chair. My brother shrugged and said she'd just been wandering again. I called emergency services, but when the nurse saw my brother, he grabbed my arm and whispered, "Sir, is that really your sibling?" I stood in the doorway of the living room at 4:15 on a Wednesday afternoon, still wearing the hospital identification bracelet from my emergency appendectomy 3 days earlier, and saw my 78-year-old mother Eleanor bound to her wheelchair with what looked like electrical cords and torn bedsheets. Her wrists showed marks from the restraints, her eyes were glazed with confusion and fear, and there was a dark stain on her clothing suggesting she'd been sitting there long enough to lose bladder control. My brother Graham was on the couch eating chips and watching a game show, the volume loud enough that he hadn't heard me come in. When I'd shouted his name, demanded to know what the hell he was doing, he'd looked up with this casual expression like I'd interrupted something mundane. He'd said Mom had been wandering again, trying to leave the house, and he'd needed to keep her safe while I was in the hospital. Said it like tying an elderly woman with dementia to a chair was a reasonable safety measure. My hands had started shaking as I'd moved to untie her, feeling the tightness of the knots, seeing the pressure marks on her thin skin. I'd been living with my mother for 2 years, ever since her Alzheimer's diagnosis had progressed to the point where she couldn't safely live alone. I was 42, divorced, working remotely as a software developer, and I'd been her primary caregiver since my father had died 5 years ago. Graham was my younger brother by 3 years, lived across town, had a family and a job managing a warehouse, and visited Mom maybe once a month, if that. When I'd been admitted to the hospital for emergency surgery after my appendix had ruptured at work, Graham had been my only option for temporary care. He'd agreed to stay at the house, make sure Mom took her medications, help her with meals and basic needs. 3 days. I'd only been gone 3 days. I'd called twice daily to check in. Graham had said everything was fine, that Mom was doing well, no problems. He'd lied about all of it. Mom had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at 73, a devastating progression that had stolen her memories and independence gradually, but relentlessly. By 78, she required constant supervision, help with bathing and dressing, medication management, and careful monitoring because she'd wander if unsupervised, convinced she needed to go to work at the elementary school where she'd taught for 30 years before retiring. I'd set up systems, door alarms, medication schedules, engaging activities to keep her occupied. The care was exhausting but manageable with routine and patience. Graham had known all of this, had been briefed multiple times on how to handle Mom's care, had been given written instructions and emergency contacts. Finding her tied to a chair suggested he'd either ignored everything or decided his convenience mattered more than her dignity and safety. I'd called emergency services immediately, told the dispatcher my elderly mother had been restrained and showed signs of neglect and possible abuse. The response had been quick, an ambulance arriving within 12 minutes, along with a police officer for the welfare check. The paramedic team had included a nurse named Simon Carver, maybe 50 years old, 26 years of emergency medical experience based on the badge years he wore. Simon had assessed Mom's condition while I'd explained what I'd found. He'd documented the restraint marks, the evidence of prolonged sitting, the dehydration signs, her confusion and distress. Then he'd asked to speak with the person who'd been caring for her. I'd pointed to Graham, still on the couch, now looking annoyed that his afternoon had been interrupted. Simon had looked at Graham. His expression had changed from professional assessment to something else, and he'd grabbed my arm gently, pulled me aside, and whispered urgently, "Sir, is that really your sibling?" The question had been so strange, so unexpected, that I'd initially thought I'd misheard. I'd confirmed yes, that was my brother Graham. Why? Simon had looked between me and Graham with this troubled expression, then had said quietly that he'd responded to calls at this address before, 3 times in the past 2 years, all involving the elderly resident, and all when a man matching Graham's description had been present. He'd said the calls had been for falls, injuries, situations that had seemed suspicious, but hadn't quite met the threshold for mandatory reporting. He'd said he'd documented concerns, but hadn't been able to prove anything. Now, seeing the restraints and the condition of my mother, those past concerns were crystallizing into a pattern he couldn't ignore. I'd felt my stomach drop, understanding that Graham's abuse hadn't started 3 days ago when I'd gone to the hospital. It had been happening for 2 years while I'd trusted him during his monthly visits. I'd been caring for Mom full-time since her diagnosis had worsened, giving up a downtown office job to work remotely so I could be home with her. The routine had been demanding but sustainable. Morning medications at 7, breakfast at 8, activities to engage her cognition, lunch at noon, afternoon rest, dinner at 6, evening medications at 8, bedtime routine at 9. On days when I'd had meetings or errands, I'd hired professional caregivers from a local agency, people trained in dementia care who understood how to maintain dignity and safety. The only times I'd asked Graham to help had been during my quarterly trips to visit my daughter at college, 3-day weekends when I'd paid him $500 to stay at the house and follow the care routine. He'd always agreed, had seemed responsible enough, had never given me reason to suspect problems. Except now, Simon was telling me there had been problems, that emergency services had been called to my house 3 times, and I'd known nothing about it. Simon had taken Mom to the hospital for evaluation and treatment, the restraint marks and dehydration requiring medical attention. The police officer, a young woman named Officer Julie Watkins, had stayed to take statements. She'd asked Graham to explain the restraints. He'd said Mom had been trying to leave the house repeatedly, that he'd been worried she'd wander into traffic or get lost, that tying her to the chair had seemed like the safest option. Officer Watkins had asked how long she'd been restrained. Graham had said off and on for the 3 days that he'd untied her for bathroom breaks and meals. His casual tone, the way he'd described it like a reasonable solution, had made me physically ill. Officer Watkins had asked if he'd considered calling me at the hospital or contacting a professional caregiver. Graham had said he'd handled it fine, that I'd been overreacting by calling 911, that old people needed firm boundaries. I'd pulled up my phone records, shown Officer Watkins the calls I'd made to Graham during my hospital stay. I'd called 6 times over 3 days, asked specifically about Mom's condition each time, and Graham had lied consistently, said she was fine, eating well, no problems. Never mentioned restraints or wandering or any issues requiring emergency services. The lies had been deliberate and systematic, not mistakes or poor judgment. Officer Watkins had taken notes, said she'd file a report with Adult Protective Services, that someone would follow up within 48 hours. She'd asked if I wanted to press charges. I'd said yes, absolutely, that restraining an elderly person with dementia wasn't caregiving, it was abuse, and I'd wanted it documented and prosecuted. Graham had started arguing then, said I was being ungrateful, that he'd taken time off work to help me, that dealing with Mom was harder than I'd admitted, and tying her up had been necessary. He'd said if I didn't like how he'd handled things, maybe I should have stayed home instead of having emergency surgery. The victim blaming, the entitlement, the complete lack of understanding that what he'd done was criminal abuse had been staggering. Officer Watkins had told him to stop talking, that he should get a lawyer, that she was documenting everything he'd said for the report. Graham had left the house angry, claiming I'd ruined our relationship over nothing, that I'd regret calling the police on family. I'd locked the door behind him and had sat on the floor trying to process what I'd discovered. The hospital had kept Mom overnight for observation and treatment. I'd driven there despite still recovering from surgery, my abdomen aching from the movement, and had met with the attending physician, Dr. Rebecca Thornton, who'd been working in geriatric medicine for 19 years. Dr. Thornton had examined Mom thoroughly, documenting injuries beyond the obvious restraint marks. There were bruises in various stages of healing on her arms and legs, consistent with rough handling over time. There was a partially healed cut on her scalp that had never been properly treated. She was significantly dehydrated and malnourished, suggesting inadequate food and water intake for days. Her medication levels were off, indicating missed doses. Dr. Thornton had asked me directly how long the caregiver had been alone with my mother. I'd said 3 days this time, but that he'd visited monthly for 2 years. Dr. Thornton's expression had darkened. She'd said the injuries she was seeing suggested a pattern of abuse extending well beyond 3 days, that some of the bruises were at least a week old, that the malnutrition indicated chronic neglect. I'd told her about Simon Carver's revelation, that emergency services had been called 3 times in 2 years during Graham's visits. Dr. Thornton had said we needed to get those incident reports, that they could establish a timeline of abuse. She'd filed a mandatory elder abuse report with the state, providing her medical findings and suspected timeline. She'd also recommended I contact an elder law attorney about protective orders and potential guardianship modification to ensure Graham could never have access to Mom again. She'd given me referrals for specialists who could evaluate Mom's injuries and provide expert testimony if criminal charges were pursued. The medical documentation was building a case I hadn't fully understood I'd needed until that moment. I'd requested the emergency services incident reports the next day, filing a formal request with the fire department and ambulance service. The reports had been provided within 48 hours, and they'd been damning. The first call had been 18 months ago, a report of an elderly woman found on the floor with facial bruising. The responding paramedics had documented that the woman's son claimed she'd fallen, but the injury pattern suggested she'd been struck rather than having fallen. The report noted concerns, but no action taken beyond transport to hospital. The second call had been 11 months ago, elderly woman with a dislocated shoulder. The son claimed she'd fallen getting out of the shower. The paramedics had noted the injury was inconsistent with the stated mechanism, documented suspicions of abuse, but again, no formal action. The third call had been 6 months ago, elderly woman with second-degree burns on her hands. The son claimed she'd touched a hot stove. The burn pattern suggested forced contact rather than accidental touch. All 3 reports had documented concerns. All 3 had included notes describing the adult son as defensive and evasive. All 3 had occurred during the 3-day periods when I'd been visiting my daughter and Graham had been supposedly caring for Mom. I'd sat at my kitchen table reading these reports, understanding with horrible clarity that my brother had been abusing our mother for at least 18 months, probably longer, and that my quarterly trips had created the opportunity. 3 days alone with her, 4 times a year, 12 days total where he'd had unsupervised access and had chosen violence and neglect over basic care. Simon Carver had responded to all 3 calls, had documented his suspicions each time, had tried to report his concerns, but had faced barriers. The system had failed Mom 3 times before I'd finally stumbled onto the truth by coming home early from a hospital stay Graham hadn't expected me to leave so soon. The Adult Protective Services investigator had been a woman named Francine Hill, 51 years old, 23 years with the agency, carrying the weary determination of someone who'd seen every kind of elder abuse imaginable. She'd interviewed me, reviewed the medical reports, examined the emergency services incident reports, and had interviewed Simon Carver about his observations. Then she'd gone to Graham's house to interview him. He'd refused to cooperate, had told her to leave his property, had claimed I was making false accusations to get revenge for some family dispute. Francine had documented his refusal, noted it raised additional red flags, and had filed a substantiated abuse finding. She'd issued an emergency protective order prohibiting Graham from any contact with Mom and recommending criminal prosecution. The APS finding had been the official documentation I'd needed, the state's acknowledgement that abuse had occurred and that my mother required protection from her own son. I'd hired an attorney named Douglas Freeman, 62 years old, 38 years specializing in elder law and abuse cases. Douglas had reviewed everything, the medical reports, the emergency services records, the APS finding, the photographs I'd taken of Mom tied to the chair. He'd told me this was one of the clearer abuse cases he'd seen, that the documentation was extensive and damning. He'd recommended I file for emergency guardianship modification, removing any potential claims Graham might have to involvement in Mom's care decisions. He'd also recommended pursuing criminal charges through the district attorney's office, that the pattern of abuse and the severity warranted prosecution. Douglas had prepared the guardianship filing, scheduled an emergency hearing, and had contacted the DA's office on my behalf. The legal machinery had started moving, slowly but deliberately, toward accountability. The emergency guardianship hearing had been scheduled for 1 week later, family court judge presiding over a matter that should have been straightforward, but was complicated by Graham's refusal to accept any wrongdoing. Judge Leonard Shaw, 68 years old, 42 years on the bench, had reviewed the medical evidence, the APS report, the emergency services records. He'd asked me to describe finding Mom tied to the chair. I'd told him everything, the restraints, the marks, her condition, Graham's casual explanation. Judge Shaw had asked if Graham was present or represented. Douglas had said Graham had been served notice, but had chosen not to appear or retain counsel. Judge Shaw had ruled from the bench that Ide was granted sole guardianship with no visitation or contact rights for Graham, that the evidence of abuse was clear and convincing, and that my mother's safety required complete separation from her abuser. The guardianship modification had been the legal protection Mom needed, ensuring Graham could never again claim any right to make decisions about her care. The criminal investigation had proceeded through the district attorney's office, a prosecutor named Angela Reeves handling the case. Angela had been with the DA's office for 16 years, specializing in vulnerable victim crimes including elder abuse. She'd reviewed the evidence package Douglas had provided, had interviewed Dr. Thornton and Francine Hill, had obtained the emergency services records and photographs. Then she'd made the decision to charge Graham with multiple counts. 3 counts of felony elder abuse based on the 3 documented emergency calls, 1 count of unlawful restraint based on tying Mom to the chair, and 1 count of criminal neglect based on the malnutrition and dehydration. The charges had carried significant prison time, the state treating elder abuse seriously, especially with such clear documentation. Graham had been arrested at his workplace, taken into custody, and had posted bail within 24 hours. Graham's wife Melanie had called me after his arrest, crying, asking how I could do this to my brother, to their family. She'd said Graham was a good man who'd made mistakes, that Ide was destroying his life over some discipline issues with a confused old woman. The characterization of systematic abuse as discipline issues had been revealing, suggesting either Melanie genuinely didn't understand what Graham had done or she'd been complicit in minimizing it. I told her the medical evidence spoke for itself, that her husband had beaten and neglected our mother repeatedly over 18 months, that the restraints were just the most recent and visible example. She'd said I must have misunderstood, that Graham loved Mom and would never hurt her. I'd asked if she'd knew about the emergency room visits, the injuries, the 3 documented calls to 911. She'd gone quiet, then had said Graham had mentioned Mom fell a lot, that it was part of her dementia. I'd told her falls don't cause burn patterns consistent with forced contact with hot surfaces, that dislocated shoulders don't come from shower slips, that facial bruising doesn't result from elderly people falling forward onto carpet. She'd hung up. The preliminary hearing had been set for 6 weeks later, meant to determine if sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial. The courtroom had been small, just the judge, the attorneys, Graham and his court-appointed lawyer, and me as the victim's representative. Angela Reeves had called Dr. Thornton to testify about the medical findings. She'd walked the court through each injury, each sign of neglect, the timeline suggesting chronic abuse rather than isolated incidents. She'd testified that in her professional opinion, the injuries were consistent with physical abuse, and the malnutrition suggested willful neglect. Graham's attorney, a public defender named Keith Vega, who'd been doing this for 12 years, had tried to suggest the injuries could have been self-inflicted or accidental. Dr. Thornton had calmly explained that the burn pattern, the bruise locations, and the injury mechanisms were inconsistent with accident or self-harm, that her professional assessment was unequivocal. Simon Carver had testified next, describing the 3 previous calls to the residents, his documented suspicions each time, his attempts to report concerns that had been inadequately followed up. He'd testified that seeing the restraint situation had confirmed his worst fears about the pattern he'd been observing. He'd said he'd wished he'd pushed harder after the first call, that maybe he could have prevented the subsequent abuse. Angela had asked if the injuries he'd documented in his reports were consistent with Dr. Thornton's findings. He'd said absolutely, that the timeline and injury patterns matched perfectly, that this wasn't coincidence, but clear evidence of repeated abuse. Keith Vega had tried to suggest the calls were just unfortunate accidents bunched together by bad luck. Simon had looked at him with visible frustration and had said 3 suspicious injuries over 18 months, all occurring during the same person's caregiving periods, wasn't bad luck. It was a pattern that should have been investigated sooner. Francine Hill from APS had testified about her investigation, the substantiated finding of abuse, Graham's refusal to cooperate. She'd described her interview with me, with medical professionals, with the documentation showing clear evidence of harm. She'd testified that in her 23 years of elder abuse investigations, this case was among the more clear-cut in terms of evidence and pattern. She'd said the only question in her professional opinion was whether the abuse had started 18 months ago with the first documented incident, or had been occurring longer without being reported. Keith Vega had asked if there was any direct evidence of Graham committing violence. Francine had said the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Opportunity, documented injuries during his care periods, his evasive responses to paramedics, his defensive reaction to investigation, and his own admission to restraining the victim. She'd said circumstantial evidence was still evidence, particularly when it formed such a clear pattern. I'd testified about finding Mom tied to the chair, about Graham's casual explanation, about the lies he'd told during my hospital calls. I testified about trusting him during my quarterly trips, about having no knowledge of the emergency calls because he'd hidden them from me. I described Mom's condition now, the fear she'd showed when men raised their voices, the way she'd flinched when I'd tried to help her with personal care. The trauma she'd sustained wasn't just physical, but psychological, and I'd had to explain to a confused elderly woman with dementia why her son couldn't visit anymore. Judge Shaw, the same judge who'd handled the guardianship, had listened to all of it, then had asked Graham's attorney if there would be a defense presentation. Keith Vega had said his client maintained the incidents were accidental and the restraints were poor judgment rather than abuse. Judge Shaw had ruled that the evidence was more than sufficient for trial, that the pattern was clear and the charges were appropriate. The trial had been scheduled for 4 months later, but Graham had taken a plea deal before it reached that point. Keith Vega had met with Angela Reeves, acknowledged that the medical evidence and pattern documentation made conviction likely, and had negotiated terms. Graham would plead guilty to 2 counts of felony elder abuse and 1 count of criminal restraint. He'd receive a sentence of 6 years in state prison, 5 years probation after release, permanent prohibition from contact with Mom or working with elderly populations, and would be required to pay restitution for medical expenses. The plea had spared Mom from having to testify or be examined by defense experts and had ensured Graham faced real consequences without the uncertainty of trial. Angela had consulted me before accepting the plea. I'd told her 6 years seemed light for 18 months of systematic abuse. She'd said it was the maximum she could get without going to trial, that trials were risky, and this guaranteed prison time plus permanent separation. I'd accepted it. The sentencing hearing had been brief. Graham had stood before Judge Shaw and had made a statement that had been mostly excuses. He'd said caring for Mom had been stressful, that he'd lost his temper sometimes, that he'd never intended permanent harm. He'd said the restraints had been a mistake, but he'd been trying to keep her safe. He'd apologized to me for the family rift, but had suggested I'd bore some responsibility for putting him in a difficult caregiving situation. Judge Shaw had interrupted him, said the defendant seemed to not understand the severity of his actions, that systematically abusing a vulnerable elder wasn't a stress response, it was criminal behavior showing conscious disregard for human dignity. He'd noted the defendant had hidden his abuse, lied to family, refused to cooperate with investigators, and had shown no genuine remorse. 6 years in prison, 5 years probation, permanent no-contact order, and registration as an elder abuser. Graham had been remanded to custody immediately. Mom had never fully recovered from the trauma. Even with professional care, therapy, and the safety of knowing Graham couldn't access her, she'd carried the psychological scars. She'd flinched at unexpected movements. She'd panicked in small spaces. She'd cried when confused or frightened in ways she'd never done before the abuse. The dementia had made it impossible to explain what had happened in terms she could retain, so each frightened moment was fresh trauma for her. I'd hired full-time professional caregivers, people trained in dementia care and trauma-informed approaches. They'd helped Mom feel safe again, had worked with her anxiety responses, had given her dignity in her care. The cost had been substantial, covered partly by liquidating some of Mom's assets and partly by the restitution payments Graham was ordered to make from prison. The money had helped, but couldn't undo the damage. Melanie had divorced Graham 6 months into his sentence, unable or unwilling to stand by someone convicted of elder abuse. She'd taken their 2 kids, moved to a different state, changed their last name to distance them from their father's crime. I'd heard through distant family that Graham's children had been told their father was sick and receiving long-term treatment, a lie to protect them from knowing their dad was a convicted abuser. The family fragmentation had been another casualty of Graham's choices, relationships destroyed because he'd decided an elderly woman with dementia was too much trouble to care for properly, and violence was easier than patience. The broader family had mostly sided with me once the medical evidence had become known. Cousins who'd initially thought I was overreacting had apologized after seeing the photographs and reading the reports. Aunts and uncles who'd grown up with Graham and remembered him as a good kid had struggled to reconcile that memory with the man who'd tied their sister to a chair. A few people had maintained that the prosecution had been too harsh, that family should protect family, but most had understood that protecting Mom from her abuser was exactly what family should do. The divide had been revealing about who valued elderly dignity versus who saw elder care as a burden to be managed by any means necessary. 2 years after Graham's conviction, Mom had passed away peacefully in her sleep at 80 years old. The Alzheimer's had progressed to late stage, her body shutting down gradually, surrounded by professional caregivers who'd treated her with dignity until the end. I'd been holding her hand when she'd died, talking to her about her teaching career and her students, things she'd sometimes still recognized even through the dementia fog. She'd never had to see Graham again. She'd never had to be restrained or hurt or neglected. The last 2 years of her life had been safe and gentle, the way every elder deserved to finish their days. That safety, hard-won through prosecution and permanent separation, had been the final gift I could give her. Graham had written from prison requesting to attend Mom's funeral. I denied the request through his prison liaison, stating that Mom's protective order remained in effect until her death, and I was honoring it beyond. He'd written again, asking for photographs or information about the service. I'd ignored the letter. He'd stolen 18 months of Mom's final years, had inflicted trauma she'd carried to her death, had violated every duty of care and family loyalty. He didn't deserve closure or forgiveness or inclusion in mourning her. He'd had his opportunity to care for her with dignity and had chosen abuse instead. The consequences of that choice included being excluded from her death as he'd been excluded from her life after his arrest. The Emergency Services Department had implemented policy changes based on Mom's case. When Simon Carver had testified about reporting his concerns 3 times without adequate follow-up, it had triggered an internal review. The department had created new mandatory reporting protocols for suspected elder abuse, required documentation and follow-up regardless of family explanations, and had partnered more closely with APS for suspected cases. The changes had been named informally as the Eleanor Protocol after my mother, a small recognition that her suffering had led to systemic improvement. Simon had told me he'd wished the protocols had existed when he'd first responded to the call about Mom's facial bruising. But at least future elderly victims might be protected faster because of lessons learned from the system's failure to protect Mom. I'd kept the house Mom had lived in, the place where I'd cared for her, and where Graham had abused her. I'd renovated extensively, changed everything about the living room where I'd found her tied to the chair, made it a space without those memories embedded in the walls. The house was mine now, filled with better memories of Mom's good years before the dementia, and before her son had decided her vulnerability was license for cruelty. I'd kept photographs of her from her teaching days, from family holidays, from times when she'd been vibrant and strong. Those were the memories I'd chosen to preserve, not the images of restraint marks and frightened confusion. Sometimes people asked me if I regretted putting my brother in prison, if destroying his life had been worth it. The question always revealed the person asking it, their values about family loyalty versus elderly protection. My answer was always the same. I didn't destroy Graham's life. He destroyed it himself by choosing to beat and neglect a defenseless elderly woman. I just ensured he faced consequences for those choices. The regret I'd carried was that I hadn't known sooner, hadn't questioned the emergency room visits that Graham had hidden, hadn't insisted on oversight during his caregiving periods. Those failures of awareness had allowed abuse to continue for 18 months before discovery. But prosecuting him once I'd known? No regret about that whatsoever. The nurse who'd grabbed my arm that day, Simon Carver, had become an unexpected ally and friend. He'd testified at every hearing, had provided detailed documentation from his 3 previous calls, had been relentless in ensuring the pattern was recognized and prosecuted. After Mom's death, he'd sent a card saying that in 26 years of emergency medicine, he'd responded to hundreds of elder abuse calls, but Eleanor's case had stayed with him because the system had failed her 3 times before finally protecting her. He'd said he'd wished he could have done more sooner, but he was glad that ultimately she'd been protected and her abuser held accountable. The guilt he'd carried for not preventing the abuse earlier had been misplaced. The system's failure hadn't been his individual fault, but I'd appreciated his commitment to both Mom's case and the policy changes that had followed. 4 years after Graham's imprisonment, he'd become eligible for parole. I'd submitted a victim impact statement opposing release, detailing the lasting effects of his abuse on Mom's final years, the trauma she'd carried until her death, the systematic nature of his violence and deception. Dr. Thornton had submitted a statement about the medical findings. Francine Hill had submitted APS documentation. Angela Reeves had provided prosecution records showing the pattern of abuse. The parole board had denied his application, citing the severity of the crimes, the vulnerable victim, and the lack of genuine remorse in his statements. He'd serve his full sentence. Justice required accountability, not early release for good behavior while imprisoned. The house where Graham lived with Melanie before his arrest had been sold during their divorce. New owners, a young family with no knowledge of its history, had moved in with children and pets and normal life. The proceeds from the sale had gone to Melanie and the kids. Graham's parental rights terminated as part of the divorce settlement, given his conviction for violent crimes. His children would grow up without him, protected from knowing their father had abused their grandmother, carrying their mother's new surname and building lives separate from his legacy. The family destruction had been complete, all radiating from his decision that an elderly woman with dementia deserved violence rather than patience. I'd thought often about that moment when Simon had grabbed my arm and asked if Graham was really my sibling, the urgency in his voice suggesting he'd known something I hadn't. That warning, based on his previous observations and professional instinct, had been the catalyst for investigation that had uncovered systematic abuse. Without Simon's recognition and documentation, Graham's lies might have continued. The abuse might have remained hidden until Mom died of neglect or injury. One person's diligence and willingness to report suspicions, despite pressure to accept family explanations, had made the difference between continued suffering and protection. The evidence had told a story I hadn't wanted to believe but couldn't deny. The medical reports showing injuries during Graham's caregiving periods, the emergency services records documenting 3 calls for suspicious injuries, the photographs of Mom restrained and marked, the timeline showing pattern rather than coincidence. The testimony from multiple professionals all reaching the same conclusion: systematic abuse by a family member who'd used his mother's vulnerability as opportunity for cruelty. That evidence, carefully documented and professionally presented, had overcome any instinct to protect family privacy or give Graham benefit of doubt. The truth, preserved in medical records and emergency reports and photographs, had demanded accountability. 6 years after finding Mom tied to that chair, I'd sold the house and moved to a smaller place, ready to fully leave behind the space where both good and terrible things had happened. I'd kept Mom's photographs, her teaching awards, mementos from her vital years. The restraints Graham had used, I'd thrown away immediately after photographing them for evidence. Those objects had held no sentimental value, just proof of cruelty that had served its purpose in court. Moving forward meant carrying Mom's good memories while leaving the physical spaces of trauma behind. Graham would eventually be released from prison, 6 years of his life spent paying for 18 months of abuse. When he got out, he'd be in his 50s, with a criminal record preventing him from elderly care work or positions of trust. He'd be estranged from his children, divorced from his wife, separated from any family who'd valued Mom's dignity over his freedom. He'd have to live with knowing that his impatience and cruelty had cost him everything while buying an elderly woman with dementia 2 years of safe care before her death. Whether that knowledge would produce genuine remorse or just resentment was beyond my control or concern. He'd face those consequences alone, which seemed appropriate given how he'd ensured Mom faced her abuse alone. The whispered question from Simon Carver that day, "Is that really your sibling?" had contained everything I'd needed to hear. That my brother wasn't who I'd thought he was, that his access to Mom had been dangerous all along, that my trust in family had nearly cost our mother everything. That question, asked urgently by someone who'd seen the pattern I'd missed, had saved Mom's final years from continued abuse. Sometimes protection required listening to outsiders who could see clearly what family loyalty obscured. Simon had seen what I couldn't, and his willingness to warn me had been the difference between extended suffering and safety. That intervention, uncomfortable and shocking at the time, had been exactly what Mom needed, even if it had destroyed my relationship with my brother forever. Her safety mattered more than family comfort. That truth, learned through her pain and Graham's prosecution, shaped how I understood family loyalty going forward. Real loyalty meant protecting the vulnerable, not protecting the abuser. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.